Welcome to the Black Gods podcast. Now, let's talk about something that comes up a lot. People who say they were into spirituality, into things like tarot, crystals, or other practices, and then they leave and go back into Christianity, saying everything they were doing was evil. And I want to approach this with clarity, not judgment, because a lot of the time, what really happened is not that spirituality itself was wrong. It's that the person was practicing something they didn't fully understand, didn't respect, or didn't approach with the right mindset. And that matters. Because when it comes to anything involving your mind, your emotions, your beliefs, your state matters. How you approach something matters. Your intention matters. A lot of people jump into practices because they're curious, because it looks interesting, or because they see other people doing it, but they don't take the time to ground themselves first. They don't take the time to build discipline, awareness, or understanding. And when you operate from confusion, fear, or instability, your experience is going to reflect that. Not because the practice itself is evil, but because you're not centered. This is why mindset is so important. If you approach anything from fear, your experience is going to be shaped by fear. If you approach something from confusion, your experience is going to feel confusing. That applies to spirituality, but it also applies to everyday life. Your state influences your experience. So when people say, I tried this and it was negative, sometimes what they're really describing is their own lack of preparation, grounding, or understanding going into it. That's why responsibility matters. Before you engage in any form of spiritual practice, you need to be grounded in yourself. You need to know who you are, what you believe, and what you're doing, not just copying what you see online, not just experimenting without awareness, because anything you do without understanding can lead to confusion. And then instead of taking accountability, it becomes easier to say, this is wrong or this is evil, instead of saying, I didn't approach this in a balanced or informed way. Now let's talk about something else, fear. A lot of people carry fear from past experiences, from upbringing, from what they were taught. Some people have what's called a church wound, where they were taught to fear anything outside of a certain belief system. And when you carry that fear into something new, it affects how you experience it. Because if you believe something is wrong, dangerous, or bad before you even begin, that belief is already shaping your experience. That's how powerful the mind is. Now, again, this is not about telling people what they should or shouldn't practice. This is about awareness, because you can't approach something with fear, confusion, and instability and then expect clarity and balance. That applies to everything. And then when those same people leave those practices, they often start speaking against things like crystals, calling them evil or dangerous. But when you really think about it, crystals are natural. They come from the earth, just like trees, just like water, just like plants. So the question becomes, what are we really reacting to? Are we reacting to the object itself, or are we reacting to the beliefs and experiences we attach to it? Because a tool is just a tool. It's how you use something, how you understand something, and what you believe about it that shapes your experience. If you approach something thinking it's negative, your experience is going to feel negative. If you approach something with confusion, your experience will reflect that confusion. That's why awareness and intention matter. You cannot skip understanding and then blame the practice. You cannot operate from fear and then expect peace. You cannot jump into something without grounding and then expect clarity. Everything requires responsibility. And that's something people don't talk about enough. Spirituality, no matter what path someone chooses, is not something to play with casually. It requires discipline, it requires self awareness, it requires emotional stability, it requires understanding. And if someone doesn't have that, it's okay to step back. It's okay to say, this is not for me right now. But that's different from saying something is inherently wrong, because sometimes the issue is not the practice, it's the approach. And when people don't separate those two things, it creates confusion not just for them, but for others who are listening. So the real message here is this: know what you're doing, be grounded in yourself. Don't move from fear. Don't copy what you don't understand, and take responsibility for your experience. Because at the end of the day, your mind, your awareness, and your understanding shape how you experience everything. And that's where your power is. And I want to go even deeper into this because this is where a lot of people get lost. A lot of people think spirituality is something outside of them, something they just pick up, try out, and put down like a trend. But that's not what it is. Spirituality is not something you play with, it's something you align with. And alignment starts with self. Before anything else, before tools, before practices, before anything, you need to know yourself. You need to be grounded in your own mind, your own emotions, your own reality. Because if you're not grounded, you're going to be easily influenced, easily confused, and easily overwhelmed. And that's where a lot of people go wrong. They jump into things without doing the inner work first. They don't know how to sit with themselves. They don't know how to regulate their emotions. They don't know how to discern what feels right and what doesn't. So when they step into something unfamiliar, instead of having clarity, they have fear. And when fear is leading, everything starts to feel unsafe, even things that aren't. And instead of pausing and asking, am I ready for this or do I understand this? They panic, step away, and then label the entire experience as wrong. But let's be real, you can't step into something deeply personal, deeply internal, without preparation, and then expect it to feel smooth. That's like walking into the ocean without knowing how to swim and then saying the ocean is dangerous. No, the ocean is what it is. You just weren't prepared, and that's the difference. Now, let's talk about discernment. Not everything is for everyone at every stage, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with saying, I'm not ready for this, or this path doesn't align with me. That's actually a sign of awareness. But what's not awareness is jumping into something blindly, having a negative experience, and then turning around and saying everything connected to it is evil or wrong. That's reaction, not reflection. And we need more reflection because when you reflect, you start asking better questions. Was I grounded when I started? Was I clear in my intention? Was I emotionally stable? Was I trying to follow others instead of understanding for myself? Those questions matter because without them, people stay in cycles of confusion. Now, let's talk about tools again, things like tarot, crystals, and other practices people often debate about. These things are not power by themselves, they are tools, and tools respond to the person using them. If someone is unstable, confused, or fearful, their experience is going to reflect that, regardless of what tool they're using. If someone is grounded, intentional, and aware, their experience is going to reflect that. So the focus should not be on blaming the tool. It should be on understanding the user because at the end of the day, you are the one thinking, you are the one feeling, you are the one interpreting your experience. That's where the real influence is. And this is where people misunderstand something very important. Power is not outside of you. No object, no tool, no practice has control over you unless you give it that control through your beliefs, your fear, or your lack of awareness. That's why self knowledge is everything. Because when you know yourself, you don't move from fear. You don't get easily shaken. You don't jump from one belief to another based on panic. You move with clarity, and clarity keeps you grounded. Now, let's also talk about accountability because this part is important. It's easier to say this was wrong than it is to say I wasn't ready or I didn't understand what I was doing. But growth requires honesty, and honesty requires you to look at your own role in your experiences, not to blame yourself, but to understand yourself. Because once you understand, you don't repeat the same mistakes. You move differently. You approach things with more care, more awareness, more intention, and that changes everything. Now let's bring this back to something simple. Not everything is meant for everyone, and not everything is meant for you at every stage. But what is meant for everyone is self awareness. Self awareness will guide you better than fear ever will. It will tell you when something aligns. It will tell you when something doesn't. It will tell you when to move forward and when to step back. And that's what people need to build first, not just knowledge of practices, but knowledge of self, because without that, anything can feel overwhelming. But with that, you become grounded, you become steady, you become clear. And when you're clear, you don't get pulled in every direction. You don't get shaken by every experience. You don't label things out of fear. You understand. And understanding is what creates balance. And this is where responsibility comes in, because at some point you have to ask yourself, what have I been taught, and is it actually true? A lot of us were raised on information that we never questioned, beliefs that were passed down without explanation, ideas that were rooted in fear, control, or incomplete understanding, and we carried those beliefs into adulthood without ever sitting down and asking, where did this come from? That's where the real work begins. It is our responsibility to relearn, not just to accept everything we were told and not to reject everything either, but to question, to research, to seek understanding for ourselves. Because when you don't question what you've been taught, you end up living someone else's version of truth. And that's not freedom. Relearning requires unlearning, and unlearning is uncomfortable because it means you have to look at things differently. It means you have to admit that some of what you believe may not have been complete. It means stepping out of what feels familiar and stepping into what feels uncertain, but that's where growth happens. And this is exactly why shadow work is so important. Shadow work is not just some trend, it's not just writing in a journal and calling it a day. It's about looking at the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, the beliefs you've never questioned, the fears you've been carrying, the reactions you don't understand. It's about asking yourself real questions. Why do I feel this way? Where did this belief come from? Is this truly mine, or was it given to me? That kind of self reflection changes everything, because once you start doing shadow work, you begin to see patterns. You begin to see how your thoughts were shaped. You begin to see how fear was planted, how narratives were repeated, how certain ideas became your truth without you ever choosing them. And when you see it, you can change it. That's the shift, because your mind is powerful. What you believe shapes how you see the world. It shapes how you respond. It shapes what you accept and what you reject. And if your mind is filled with unexamined beliefs, then your life will reflect that. But when you start questioning, researching, and learning for yourself, your mind starts to expand. You stop reacting out of fear. You stop judging out of conditioning. You start thinking. And thinking leads to clarity. Now, this doesn't mean you blindly accept everything new either. It means you take your time, you research, you cross reference, you listen, you observe, you reflect. You don't just follow, you understand. Because real knowledge is not about repeating what someone else said, it's about understanding it deeply enough to form your own perspective. And that's what shifts your mind, not force, not fear, but understanding. And once your mind shifts, everything else follows. You move differently, you speak differently, you see things differently. Things that once scared you don't have the same hold on you anymore. Things that once confused you start to make sense. Things you once rejected, you now approach with curiosity instead of fear. That's growth. That's awareness. And that's what breaks cycles. Because cycles continue when people don't question. But the moment you start asking, why do I believe this? Who taught me this? Is this actually true? That's when the shift begins. And once your mind shifts, you can't go back to seeing things the same way because now you're aware. And awareness is what leads to freedom, not just physical freedom, but mental and emotional freedom. The kind where you're no longer controlled by fear, by misinformation, or by beliefs that were never truly yours. You start living from understanding. You start moving from clarity. You start choosing for yourself. And that's where your power really is. This is the Black Gods Podcast.